Hello, it's wonderful to be here. It's wonderful to talk to such a diverse audience. I'll say at the beginning, if you want to doodle as well as write questions or fidget or whatever you want to do, just be comfortable. You're not going to distract me, and we can all cope with it. So be as comfortable as you like. So I'm going to talk to you today about why I think theology has something important to contribute to our societal understanding of neurodiversity. That's really the overarching theme, that theology's got something really important to contribute to this debate. Because I don't think in the UK, and definitely not if we think about the wider world, that things are as secular or as atheistic as sometimes we're told they are. Most people, including people with a range of neurodiversities, still believe in, experience, and do religious and spiritual activities. Whether that's participating in a traditional, established religious community, praying to a god maybe they're not quite sure they believe in, talking to a relative that has died, seeing ghosts or angels, meditating, or feeling a spiritual connection with the natural world. I don't think we live in a society where religion is becoming or has ever been irrelevant to people's lives. But I do think that because of some significant changes in Britain over the last 100 years or so, there's less awareness of theology specifically. And that is theology, by that I mean the intellectual study of God and everything in the world as it relates to God. Theology is still taught in most British universities, just about, and it's an exciting subject. I teach it, I love it. It's a multidisciplinary subject that teaches students to draw together literature, history, biology, politics, and think about life's biggest questions. Think about something that's bigger even than humanity. And in this talk, we're going to be doing that. We're going to be thinking theologically. We're going to be asking some big questions about our theme, neurodiversity. So first, I'm going to give, and here's the structure, I'm going to give a summary of the concept of neurodiversity, a little bit about its history and its core principles. Second, although this concept isn't explicitly religious in any way, I do think there's something theological going on with our shift away from discussion of psychological disorders and our society's slow embrace of the language of neurodiversity instead. So I want to say there's something theological going on there and how we're changing our language. And thirdly, I'm going to think more specifically about Christian theology, about Christianity, and discuss what a Christian understanding of neurodiversity might be. And then, as you'll see, as Mark's already said, we're going to have some time for discussion on tables so you can process what I've been saying, and form your own opinions about it. And then there'll be time for you to ask me questions at the end. So, first off, I just need to get rid of this. So. First off, the history and the core principles of neurodiversity. So neurodiversity and related terms like neurodiverse, neurodivergent, even neurotypical, are not strictly speaking medical or biological terms. Sometimes we treat them like that, but they're not really medical terms. They're rather social, political language. They're a way of framing, interpreting, responding to biomedical discoveries, biomedical information that we have. So I want to be clear that neurodiversity is not necessarily anti-science or anti-medicine, but it does often challenge and seek to change the scientific imagination, right? Now, it might seem unusual for me to use the word scientific and imagination together. Some of you might have thought that was strange. But the natural sciences are as creative and imaginative an exercise as any of the humanities. They rely on human inspiration, creative ideas, and differing interpretations, just like you would with a book or a poem. So the concept of neurodiversity aims to reorientate the scientific imagination away from viewing all psychological differences between us as deficits, as a problem that needs to be avoided or cured. Instead, the neurodiversity interpretation and paradigm wants to view these differences as equally valid, even when they're in a minority, even when it's a minority form of psychology or way of being human. So when the Australian sociologist Judy Singer coined the term, she came up with the word neurodiversity in 1998, she drew inspiration from the ecological idea of biodiversity as a way to describe how a variety increases resilience and sustainability in an environment. So to increase biodiversity, for example, in plants and trees, means that that forest or that area is more likely to withstand fire or disease effectively, right? We all know this basic idea. So too, Singer claims neurodiversity increases the resilience of human communities. So that when a human society faces challenges, if we're neurodiverse as a community, we're more likely to survive and cope with those challenges well. In fact, she recently wrote in a more recent book this quote that I think captures this perfectly. She writes, "The more neurodiversity is respected and facilitated within a culture, the more stable, adaptable, and sustainable that culture is." End quote. So the concept of neurodiversity is about orientating ourselves and emphasizing the positive contribution rather than merely only focusing on the struggles or the problems that come with being a community that includes people who approach the world in fairly radically different ways. And Singer's comparison with biodiversity, though, helps raise an important question. Does neurodiversity, the word, refer to a diversity shared by all humanity, or is it a minority form of cognition that only some people have? Is it really a way to describe an individual or a group? I've already missed a slide, but there we are. Let's have some nice nature for biodiversity. Sorry about that. So this term, neurodiversity, I think has quickly become quite popular in British society, and so it gets used in both these ways, to refer to the individual and to refer to the group. So we can imagine this in the following way. So imagine a conversation where one person says, "I'm neurodiverse," and another person might reply, "Well, aren't we all?" Right? When this happens, the first person might feel that the difference that they're trying to express, their unique contribution they make, perhaps the unique struggle that they're having, is being ignored or minimized. And that's not really okay. But the second speaker also has a point. We are all different to some degree, and acknowledging this is a powerful way to depathologize, to normalize conditions such as autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyscalculia, and dyspraxia. So, what should we do in this imagined conversation? How should we understand the concept so that it remains a powerful tool to celebrate difference without kind of minimizing or disregarding that difference? So one solution is to focus purely on the words we use and to make sure everyone's using the words in the right way. It's a bit difficult to achieve, but there we are. So one way is to say that the word neurodivergent refers to an individual and neurodiverse refers to a community, and we just need to make sure we don't misspeak. After all, one person can't really be neurodiverse on their own, because diversity already implies many, right? And there really are no hard and fast lines either between neurodivergent, say, as an individual, and neurotypical ways of thinking. Nor should we think of it as two poles and you can just move in a straight line from one to the other. Human variety is far too complex and wondrous to be reduced to such a binary of two categories. But I think the important point is this. We only see the full diversity of human cognitive styles when we prioritize those who happen to be the minority. When we learn to accept and value differences, even when those differences buck uncomfortably against our norms, our expectations. So neurodiversity is therefore used in this paper to refer to this minority group of people whose particular cognition and behavior are such that the deliberate provisions do need to be made and past injustices need to be corrected in order for their full flourishing within society, but apart out of the conviction that when we make such provisions or correct such injustices, actually we all benefit and flourish as a result. So that was the first question to clear up. There's been some confusion around the concept. The second question is, what specific conditions should we include? And after this question, I will move on to the theology bit. But what specific conditions should we include? After all, as I've said, neurodivergence isn't a medical concept. It's not a diagnosis in and of itself, but rather it's a social and political, and I think theological way of grouping diagnoses, medical diagnoses, to create a shared sense of solidarity. So which conditions to include? So when people think of neurodiversity, often autism is the first condition that comes to mind. And one of the reasons for that is because the word, although it was coined by Judy Singer in Australia, it was very quickly picked up by the autistic online community and circulated there for probably 2 decades before it really got out into the rest of society in any major way. So it's got that kind of origin story that means we associate it with autism. But Singer, and indeed the word, is definitely meant to be wider than autism. It doesn't really work if it's just a synonym for autism. So a quick internet search will say that it includes the list I've already given actually once, which is autism, ADHD and ADD, dyslexia, dyscalculia and dyspraxia. This is the list that the NHS consider to be neurodiverse conditions at the moment. But if it doesn't take too much Googling to realize that you can quite quickly find a slightly broader list. So you get the same ones to start, but then also add mood and personality disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder and Tourette's syndrome. More controversially, some want to expand the neurodiversity umbrella even further to include what is commonly grouped as mental health conditions, such as depression, anxiety, bipolar, eating disorders, and schizophrenia. So what's at stake here in which list we think gets to be included under the neurodiversity umbrella and which doesn't? We might notice, for example, that the first list are all congenital conditions, i.e. you have them from birth. That's not true, particularly of the last list. Some of those conditions you can acquire midway through life. But I don't think that's the best way to carve up this difference. More deeply, the question about which specific conditions to include under the umbrella of neurodiversity depends on what we think a flourishing life looks like and which forms of human experience captured by these diagnoses we want to affirm as good and cultivate in our society, and which we think everyone and the individual and society at large would be better off without. So, for example, if you think autism, to use the typical example, is a form of neurodiversity, then that would mean that you do not think we should cure autism or prevent it in any way, and in fact that autistic people shouldn't be forced to pretend to be not autistic or have to change to become less apparently autistic in order to fit into society, right? That would be one of the practical implications of this label. And similarly, if you think depression is a form of neurodiversity, that would mean we shouldn't cure or avoid depression. So we can see how the practical examples work out. And I'll tell you that my own current thinking is probably the same as the NHS list, the first one. I'm actually, though, quite unsure about the middle list. Some of those I really can't make up my mind about. Tourette's syndrome in particular. Obsessive compulsive disorder comes in different forms that might fall on different sides of the divide. But I'm very uncomfortable with the ones in red being included, right? That's just me. And what I really want to talk about is not trying to convince you I'm right about that, as to try and think, what kind of decision is it that we're making when we're making that decision? How do we figure this out as a society? Because it's a normative decision. It's a decision about what it means to live a good life, not a medical decision that we can just wait for science to kind of discover more information for us, even though it's very good at that, and decide for us. So that brings me to my second section, From Disorder to Diversity, a Theological Shift. All visions of human flourishing, thriving, the good life, the meaning of life, are inherently theological. They are theological because your idea of what a good, full, or maybe even we could use the word perfect, human life is bound up fairly obviously in your idea of what goodness is, what perfection is. And goodness and perfection themselves are what some people call God. God is goodness itself. So neurodiversity is obviously theological for people who believe in a God, a personal God and a creator. They might ask questions like, why did God make psychological differences? Or will all these psychological differences still exist in heaven? Or in the Christian view, you might say, in the new creation when we have perfect bodies. And I'll talk more about explicitly Christian theology of neurodiversity shortly, but first I want to stick with this slightly broader sense of theology. So one way to see this broader sense is to think about why in the first place we called these differences disorders. Why did we call them psychological disorders? I find this word disorder quite intriguing. Here's another contrast. So unlike the word disability, which can be understood traditionally as a lack of a specific ability, like something quite specific, like sight or walking. And I know the word is more complicated now, but at no point could disorder be understood quite like that, right? It's already a little bit more vague and a little bit more nebulous and universal. Whereas the term disability presupposes a certain ability, the term disorder presupposes an order to things, an order to the world, an order to the human mind, an order to society. Put simply, we can only speak of psychological disorders if we imagine there's a divinely created order in the first place. The idea that creation manifests a divine order, perhaps a law-like regularity or an intelligible unity, has been a long-standing and prominent point at the dialogue and friendship between theology and religion and science, the natural sciences. It's often celebrated today as one way that the sciences have been and continue to be influenced by religious thought. Historians have argued, for example, that it's only in the context of a European widespread belief about a divine lawgiver that the idea of scientific laws of nature could have been imagined and created by scientists. So the divine order, however, did not just extend into the natural world with these natural laws of physics and biology and whatnot, but also into cognitive and mental reasoning of rational creatures. That's this idea of a rational order as what made scientific discovery possible, made political ordering of a society possible, makes theological inquiry also possible. And we can see this intertwining of the kind of scientific, the political, and the theological in this shift from psychological disorders to diversities, neurodiversities. This shift in language concerns how we interpret as I've said, and understand the meaning of psychological and neuroscientific research. So there's something scientific, clearly. But it's also political, because it concerns how we arrange ourselves in society. So it impacts medical funding, employment law, the justice system. All these things are going to be impacted by neurodiversity once this concept filters through a bit further. But as I'm trying to argue, it's also a theological concept, because it concerns our vision of the good life, what we view as ordered towards the good in ourselves, what parts of our thinking, our cognition, our behavior we can imagine to be compatible with justice and flourishing. So I think it's in this broad sense of a theological concept. But what about in the more narrow sense of theological, i.e. the kind of worldview and the particular way of reasoning from within a particular religious tradition, Christianity? So it might seem that abandoning the idea of a divine order and disorders, psychological disorders, to shift to diversity might be a kind of anti-religious move. Because you might think or worry that if we give up on a divine order, then we have to give up on the divine bit, the God as well. But I don't think that's true. I think the language of diversity is just as deeply theological as the language of disorder was. But it reflects quite a different vision of God. Indeed, it reflects a different idea of what Christians call the kingdom of God. So what might a Christian say about neurodiversity? And where do we find resonances between this concept of neurodiversity, this celebration of difference, and the Christian narrative or Christian core beliefs? Well, the first place I want to start is with God himself. So for Christians, God is triune. And that means God includes difference already. God includes some measure of diversity. One aspect of neurodiversity that I didn't talk about in the first section is the neuro part. Right? I just kind of took that for granted a little bit. But some people thinking about what neurodiversity means are actually quite worried about the neuro part, because they're worried that it's narrowing our attention to focus just on brains. When in fact the difference is, in conditions like autism and ADHD and dyspraxia, etc., are not just differences about the brain. Of course, the brain's involved, but we're talking about whole people, right? We're talking about whole bodies, how people relate to the world. Brains are important, but you're not just a brain. And I think this concern is valid, but the reason I introduce it here rather than earlier is because it also helps me solve a problem. The Christian God is one God but three persons, right? Triune. But three persons does not mean three brains, right? God doesn't have three brains. In fact, apart from the person of Jesus, who is one of these three persons, God the Father and God the Spirit don't have a brain at all. Because the term persons in Christianity does not refer obviously to brains, but neither to individual centers of consciousness in the same way it does when we're talking about human persons. But we might say that God's three persons do refer to three different ways of being, three different ways of relating, three different ways of perhaps even experiencing. And if we can say that the God of Christianity includes difference and diversity, and that difference and diversity is something to do with how God relates, then I think we might be able to say something like the God of Christianity is neurodiverse, which would, if we can say that, I think a really profound and intriguing idea. And that's because, remember, I've already said that to use the word God is to point to goodness. Right, is to point to something to aspire to point to the source of all good things. So to in any way associate neurodiversity with God, even if it's analogous or literal, is to say something quite profound and to kind of nail down this idea that neurodiversity is not a problem to be solved. What else might a Christian say about neurodiversity? Well, after the God part, Christians might say that neurodiversity has been part of the divinely created diversity of the natural world. Of course, this is quite an easier one to do than the first one, and you can quite quickly draw, like Judy Singer, on the biodiversity and say, just like that, so God created neurodiversity. And since neurodiversity includes differences in communication styles, that's one of the most prominent areas of difference, then we might also turn to the famous story of the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11 and see it not so much as a curse or a punishment for human pride and success, but as a way that God sought to maintain human diversity when human society itself was trying to achieve uniformity and empire. Just to clarify, this isn't a reading of Genesis 11 that I've come up with. It's one that Old Testament scholars, I've discovered in Old Testament scholars, is a kind of, I wouldn't call it the majority view, but it's definitely gaining popularity, that actually this section of Genesis is an anti-imperial, pro-diversity narrative, which is not the way it's normally been taught. But perhaps most importantly, a theology of neurodiversity offers a practical challenge for the church to be a neurodiverse church if it is going to mirror and image God. Articles in the Harvard Business Review and similar kind of magazines suggest that the world of business is turning slowly towards embracing the idea that a company with more neurodiversity isn't just a morally nice idea, but will actually give your company a competitive edge and increase market performance. Slightly distasteful as I find that, can we say that the church has embraced a parallel shift away from a purely charity-based model of inclusion to something more like a neurodiversity model? Not yet, but I think the church should. Increasing the visibility and acceptance of neurodiverse people within the church is not solely a moral responsibility, though I think it is that, nor should it be an act of charity. I think it's a theological mandate. Furthermore, embracing neurodiversity has the potential to benefit the church, to pioneer new ministries and increase, I think, the spiritual health of communities. And that's not because I think neurodiverse individuals are more saintly. I don't think that's right. But because a wide range of cognitive approaches and preferences are going to increase the probability of spotting problems earlier and maximizing our creativity in terms of solutions. Neurodiverse people can be helpful in that sense in showing neurotypical people where they're perhaps putting too much value on the wrong things, making something into an idol, just as neurotypical people can do the same thing for their neurodiverse brothers and sisters in Christ. So in a religious community, we might even say that neurodiversity increases the range of different ways that people can discern the voice of God speaking in their midst. So I'm now going to recap to conclude, before we open it up for some discussion and sharing what we've been thinking as I've been talking. So in this talk, I unpacked the concept of neurodiversity, and I argued that the shift from psychological disorders to forms of neurodiversity is a decision, and the decision, remember, about which specific conditions and diagnoses to include under this umbrella term is not a medical decision, but a theological decision and part of a wider theological shift. It is theology, even when it's not tied to a particular religious tradition or set of beliefs, that is undergirding these changes that we're seeing in our language and indeed in our practices as a society. But of course, when those are paired with a particular set of beliefs, we will be able to articulate a theological understanding of neurodiversity much more concretely, much more clearly and powerfully, I think, as a result. So I tried to show this by briefly giving some tasters of how a Christian might view neurodiversity, fitting it in within their view of the world as created by a God that is in themselves triune and diverse. And I hope this taster of a Christian theology of neurodiversity also shows something of how Christianity, how the Christian narrative can bolster or reinforce the central claim and idea that neurodiversity itself is trying to make. And it perhaps can allow for an even stronger, even louder celebration of all our human differences. So that's what I've got for you. And I think, are you going to say something, Mark, as we move into talking about these ideas together? So thank you very much for listening.
Let's give Joanna a hand of applause.